Since the end of the Second World War, the Western Allies, principally the United States and its NATO partners, have fought a long succession of wars across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Europe. These conflicts have been justified under a shifting array of banners: containment of communism, defense of democracy, humanitarian intervention, counterterrorism, and the protection of international order. Yet when examined in aggregate rather than in isolation, a compelling case can be made that every major war fought by the Western Allies since 1945 has amounted to a tragic waste of human life and material resources, producing outcomes that were at best marginally beneficial and at worst catastrophically destructive. The pattern that emerges is not one of necessary sacrifice yielding lasting peace, but of repeated military overreach, strategic misjudgment, and moral contradiction. The Korean War, often framed as a police action to halt communist expansion, set the template. Millions of Koreans were killed, cities were reduced to rubble, and the peninsula was left divided almost exactly where it began. The war did not resolve the ideological conflict it was meant to contain. Instead, it entrenched a permanent state of hostility, produced one of the world's most militarized borders, and locked North Korea into decades of isolation and repression. South Korea eventually prospered, but this outcome owed far more to internal political and economic developments in the decades after the war than to the conflict itself. The staggering human cost, coupled with the strategic stalemate, makes it difficult to argue that the war achieved results commensurate with its devastation. Vietnam made the waste more explicit. Framed as a bulwark against the domino effect of communism, the war consumed enormous American and Allied resources and cost the lives of millions of Vietnamese, along with tens of thousands of Western soldiers. After years of bombing, chemical defoliation, and counterinsurgency operations, the war ended precisely as it might have without intervention, with the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The conflict destabilized neighboring Cambodia and Laos, contributing to genocidal violence and regional chaos. At home, it eroded trust in government and left deep psychological scars on veterans and civilians alike. In hindsight, even many of its architects conceded that Vietnam was not a vital strategic interest, making the scale of its destruction especially difficult to justify. The Cold War's end did not halt this pattern, it merely changed its rhetoric. In the Middle East, Western interventions repeatedly promised stability and delivered prolonged disorder. The 1991 Gulf War is often cited as a successful intervention, yet its aftermath undermines that claim. While Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait, the war entrenched a sanctions regime that devastated Iraqi civilian life throughout the 1990s, contributing to widespread malnutrition and disease. It also left Saddam Hussein in power, setting the stage for future conflict rather than resolving the underlying problem. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was an even starker example of squandered life and resources. Justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction and the promise of democratic transformation, the war dismantled the Iraqi state without a viable plan for what would replace it. The result was years of sectarian violence, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, and the rise of extremist groups, including the Islamic State. Trillions of dollars were spent, infrastructure was destroyed, and an entire generation was traumatized, all to eliminate a threat that did not exist and to pursue an ideological vision that proved fatally naive. Afghanistan, the longest war in Western history, further reinforces the argument. The initial objective of dismantling al-Qaeda after the September 11 attacks quickly expanded into an ambitious project of nation-building. 2 decades of fighting, aid spending, and foreign military presence failed to create a self-sustaining Afghan state. When Western forces withdrew, the Taliban rapidly returned to power, effectively restoring the political order that existed before the invasion. The war consumed vast resources and claimed countless lives, yet its ultimate outcome suggests that the fundamental political realities of Afghanistan were never meaningfully altered by military force. Western involvement in Africa, though often smaller in scale, follows the same logic. Interventions in Libya, Somalia, Mali, and elsewhere have been framed as humanitarian necessities or counterterrorism operations. Libya stands as a particularly grim case. The 2011 NATO intervention helped topple Muammar Gaddafi, but offered no coherent plan for what would follow. The country descended into factional warfare, becoming a hub for arms trafficking, human smuggling, and regional instability. What was sold as a limited intervention to protect civilians ended by exposing far more people to violence and insecurity than before. Defenders of these wars often argue that inaction would have been worse, or that intentions matter even when outcomes are grim. Yet this reasoning collapses under scrutiny. Good intentions do not resurrect the dead, rebuild shattered societies, or justify the repeated failure to learn from past mistakes. Moreover, many of these interventions were driven not purely by humanitarian concern, but by geopolitical calculation, domestic political pressure, or economic interest. The gap between stated ideals and actual conduct, civilian casualties, support for authoritarian allies, and the normalization of perpetual war undermines claims of moral necessity. The resource costs alone demand condemnation. Trillions of dollars have been diverted from education, healthcare, infrastructure, and climate mitigation into wars that produced little lasting benefit. These expenditures enriched defense contractors and sustained military bureaucracies while delivering diminishing returns in security. Meanwhile, the social costs, veteran suicide, psychological trauma, and the erosion of civil liberties continue to reverberate within Western societies themselves. Perhaps most damning is the consistency of failure. Each war is presented as unique, an exception justified by extraordinary circumstances, yet the outcomes repeat with grim regularity. Initial military success, followed by protracted instability, civilian suffering, and eventual withdrawal without decisive achievement. This pattern suggests not a series of unfortunate anomalies, but a structural inability to use military force to engineer political solutions in complex societies. None of this is to deny that the post-war world has contained genuine threats, or that non-violent options are always available. It is to argue that war, as practiced by the Western Allies since 1945, has overwhelmingly failed to deliver on its promises. It has not produced lasting peace, stable democracy, or global security proportional to its costs. Instead, it has normalized destruction as a tool of policy and treated human lives, both foreign and domestic, as expendable. Viewed across the full sweep of history from Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, and across the Middle East and Africa, the conclusion is difficult to escape. These wars were not tragic necessities that sadly but successfully defended a safer world. They were vast, recurring wastes of life and resources, driven by overconfidence in military power and an enduring refusal to confront its limits.